On the morning of August 3rd, 1937, Eleanor Forster ran her finger along the newly painted wall of what had once been Virginia's most notorious death chamber and felt something wet. At first, she assumed it was condensation from the humid summer air, but when she brought her finger to her lips, the taste was unmistakably salt. Not the mineral salt of the earth or sea, but the bitter, metallic salt of human tears mixed with the fierce sweat of a man facing his final moments. Within hours, every wall in the converted room was weeping the same crystalline substance, forming ghostly patterns that seemed to outline the shape of a chair that was no longer there. The chair where 43 condemned men had taken their final breaths, their bodies convulsing against leather restraints as electric currents surged through their systems. Eleanor's husband, James, had purchased the decommissioned Richmond State Penitentiary building for a fraction of its value, planning to convert the former execution facility into their family home. What they hadn't planned for was that some stains go deeper than paint can cover. The property had seemed like a remarkable opportunity when the Virginia Department of Corrections announced the sale of the old penitentiary buildings in early 1937. Built in 1888, the massive brick complex had housed Virginia's electric chair from 1908 until 1936, when executions were moved to a newer facility. The state was eager to dispose of the property, and James Forster, a successful Richmond businessman, saw potential in the solid construction and spacious rooms. Official records from the Virginia State Archives document the history of executions at the old Richmond Penitentiary. Between 1908 and 1936, the electric chair known as Old Sparky had claimed exactly 43 lives. The execution chamber, where the Forsters planned to create their living room, had witnessed every one of these deaths, each one carefully documented in prison logs that detailed the final moments of condemned men and women. The electric chair had been installed under the supervision of Warden Samuel Hayes, who believed that electrical execution represented a more humane alternative to hanging. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Richmond Times-Dispatch praised the new method as scientific and instantaneous, promising that condemned prisoners would die without suffering. The reality, as recorded in the detailed logs kept by the prison's medical staff, was far different. Dr. Marcus Webb, the prison physician who attended every execution from 1908 to 1928, maintained meticulous records of each death. His notes, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, reveal that electrical execution was often neither quick nor painless. Many condemned prisoners required multiple jolts of electricity, their bodies fighting against death with a tenacity that horrified witnesses. The medical logs document cases where prisoners remained conscious and aware even after the first surge of current, their eyes moving and mouths working soundlessly against the leather bit placed between their teeth. The most disturbing entries in Dr. Webb's records concern the physiological effects of electrical execution on the human body. The intense heat generated by the electrical current caused severe burns and sometimes boiled the fluids in the condemned person's brain and organs. The doctor noted that many executed prisoners wept continuously during their final minutes, not from emotion, but because the electrical current stimulated their tear ducts. The salt from these involuntary tears, mixed with perspiration forced from their pores by fear and electrical stimulation, left distinctive stains on the chair and surrounding walls. Dr. Webb's final report, written upon his retirement in 1928, contained a disturbing observation that would prove prophetic for the Forster family. He noted that despite regular cleaning and repainting, the execution chamber walls continued to show salt residue that seemed to seep through any surface treatment applied. The doctor theorized that the repeated trauma of violent death had somehow saturated the very structure of the building, creating a permanent record of human suffering that could not be easily erased. The Forster family consisted of James, a 42-year-old lumber merchant, his wife Eleanor, age 38, and their 3 children, Patricia, 16, Robert, 14, and young Margaret, only 8 years old. They had been renting a modest house in Richmond's Fan District while saving money to purchase a larger home. The opportunity to buy the former penitentiary building at auction seemed like the answer to their prayers, providing them with the space their growing family needed at a price they could afford. The conversion project began in June 1937 with the hiring of Thompson Construction Company, a local firm experienced in residential renovations. The construction crew, led by foreman William Thompson, initially showed reluctance to work on the former execution chamber, but financial necessity overcame their superstitions. The men had families to feed, and work was scarce during the lingering effects of the Great Depression. Thompson's crew began by removing the electric chair and its associated electrical equipment. The chair itself had been sold to a private collector who planned to display it in a macabre museum, but the electrical infrastructure proved more difficult to eliminate. Heavy cables ran through the walls and floor, connecting to a generator room in the basement. Removing these cables required extensive demolition that revealed disturbing details about the building's construction. Behind the walls, workers discovered that the original builders had installed special ventilation systems designed to remove the odors associated with electrical execution. The smell of burning flesh and hair, combined with the release of bodily fluids that occurred during death, had required sophisticated air handling to make the chamber bearable for witnesses and officials. These ventilation shafts had apparently collected and concentrated decades of death-related odors, creating pockets of air that remain nauseating even after years of disuse. The demolition also revealed evidence of the psychological impact the execution chamber had on those who worked there. Hidden behind a panel, workers found a collection of personal items left by prison guards and officials over the years. These included religious medals, small bottles of whiskey, and handwritten prayers asking for protection from the evil they witnessed in their daily duties. Most disturbing was a diary kept by a guard named Thomas Mitchell, whose entries documented the cumulative psychological damage caused by witnessing regular executions. Mitchell's diary entries, spanning from 1915 to 1923, provide a harrowing account of the mental toll extracted by the execution chamber. The guard described nightmares that plagued him for years, dreams in which the faces of executed prisoners appeared to him demanding justice or mercy. He wrote of a persistent feeling that the chamber was inhabited by the spirits of those who had died there, spirits that grew more agitated with each new execution. His final entry, dated March 15, 1923, simply stated, "I cannot watch another man die. The dead are watching me now. They want something from me, but I don't know what." The renovation work progressed slowly due to unexpected complications that seemed to multiply with each day. The contractors discovered that the building's electrical system had been compromised by decades of high-voltage use, requiring complete rewiring. The plumbing had been damaged by the acidic cleaning solutions used to remove biological evidence after each execution, necessitating extensive replacement. Most problematic of all, the walls themselves seemed to resist conventional renovation techniques. Paint would not adhere properly to the walls of the former execution chamber, appearing to bubble and peel within hours of application. Multiple coats of primer failed to provide a stable base, and the paint continued to separate and fall away in sheets. Thompson's workers tried different types of paint and preparation methods, but nothing seemed to work. The walls appeared to be actively rejecting any attempt to cover their original surface. The flooring presented similar challenges. The original wooden floor had been stained dark by decades of blood and other bodily fluids that had seeped between the boards despite regular cleaning. Thompson's crew attempted to sand and refinish the wood, but the stains persisted no matter how deeply they cut. Eventually, they decided to install new hardwood over the original flooring, but even this solution proved problematic when the new wood began to warp and buckle within days of installation. As the renovation struggles continued into July, the construction workers began reporting strange experiences in the building. Several men claimed to hear sounds that resembled electrical humming coming from walls where no electrical equipment existed. Others reported sudden temperature drops in the former execution chamber, despite the sweltering Virginia summer heat. Most troubling were reports of a persistent smell that seemed to come and go without apparent cause, an acrid odor reminiscent of burning hair and flesh. William Thompson documented these unusual occurrences in his daily reports to James Forster, initially attributing them to the building's history and the workers' knowledge of its past use. However, as the phenomena intensified and began affecting his most experienced and level-headed employees, Thompson began to suspect that the building itself might be somehow damaged by its violent history. His reports from late July describe an increasingly hostile work environment where men refused to work alone in certain areas, and productivity suffered due to constant interruptions from unexplained disturbances. The breakthrough in understanding the building's resistance to renovation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Helena Morrison, a chemistry professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, had heard about the construction problems from her neighbor who worked for Thompson Construction. Intrigued by the reports of salt deposits appearing on walls, despite repeated cleaning and painting, Dr. Morrison offered to analyze samples of the mysterious substance. Her laboratory analysis revealed that the salt deposits were indeed human in origin, containing a complex mixture of sodium chloride, proteins, and other organic compounds consistent with human tears and perspiration. More significantly, the deposits contained trace amounts of electrical burns residue, suggesting they originated from the physiological reactions of people subjected to electrical current. Dr. Morrison's report concluded that the building materials had been saturated with human biological matter over decades of use, creating a permanent contamination that continued to leach through any surface treatment applied. Armed with Dr. Morrison's scientific analysis, James Forster faced a difficult decision. The renovation was already over budget and behind schedule, but abandoning the project would mean losing his substantial investment in the property. Eleanor had fallen in love with the building's potential despite its grim history, and their children were excited about the prospect of living in such a unique and spacious home. Against his better judgment, James decided to proceed with the conversion, hoping that time and continued treatment would eventually overcome the building's stubborn resistance to change. The Forster family moved into their converted home on August 1st, 1937. Even though the renovation was not completely finished. The former execution chamber had been transformed into their living room, furnished with a large sofa positioned where the electric chair had once stood. Eleanor had decorated the room with cheerful colors and family photographs, attempting to create a warm, welcoming atmosphere that would help her family forget the room's dark history. The first signs of trouble appeared within 48 hours of moving in. Eleanor discovered the salt deposits on the living room walls during her morning inspection of their new home, but initially dismissed them as residual effects from the renovation work. However, when the deposits continued to appear, despite repeated cleaning, she began to suspect that the building's problems were more serious than they had anticipated. The salt deposits formed distinctive patterns on the walls, creating shapes that seemed almost intentional rather than random. Eleanor noticed that the patterns appeared to outline the dimensions of the former electric chair and its associated equipment, as if the building itself retained some memory of the objects that had once occupied the space. More disturbing was the observation that the patterns seemed to move and change over time, shifting positions slightly from day to day in ways that defied explanation. The family's youngest daughter, Margaret, was the first to comment on the unusual nature of their new home. The 8-year-old told her mother that the living room walls were crying and asked why their house was so sad. When Eleanor tried to explain that buildings couldn't cry, Margaret insisted that she could hear the walls making soft weeping sounds, especially at night when the house was quiet. The child's comments were initially dismissed as imagination, but other family members soon began noticing similar phenomena. Patricia, the 16-year-old daughter, reported difficulty sleeping due to sounds she described as electrical humming combined with what sounded like whispered conversations coming from inside the walls. The teenager's bedroom was directly above the former execution chamber, and she claimed the sounds were loudest during the early morning hours between 3 and 4 a.m. Her parents initially attributed these reports to adjustment anxiety related to their move to a new and unusual home. Robert, the 14-year-old son, experienced the most dramatic encounters with the building's strange behavior. The boy reported seeing figures in the living room during the late evening hours, shadowy shapes that appeared to be seated in chairs that weren't there. When questioned about these sightings, Robert provided detailed descriptions of men in prison clothing who seemed to be waiting for something terrible to happen. His parents were concerned enough about these reports to consult with their family physician, Dr. Andrew Campbell, who examined Robert and found no evidence of physical or mental illness. Dr. Campbell's examination of Robert revealed an interesting anomaly. The boy's resting heart rate was significantly elevated, and he showed signs of chronic stress despite having no apparent reason for anxiety. More significantly, Robert's description of the phantom figures he claimed to see matched historical records of men who had actually been executed in the room. The physician noted that Robert had no access to these historical records and could not have known specific details about the appearance and clothing of executed prisoners without some other source of information. The psychological effects of living in the converted execution chamber became more pronounced as August progressed. Eleanor began experiencing vivid nightmares featuring electrical equipment and burning flesh. Dreams so realistic that she often woke with the taste of smoke in her mouth. James found himself unable to concentrate on his business affairs, distracted by persistent thoughts about the men who had died in his living room. The children's behavior became increasingly erratic, with frequent mood swings and complaints of feeling constantly watched by unseen observers. The salt deposits on the walls continued to increase in both quantity and complexity, despite the family's efforts to clean and paint over them. By mid-August, the patterns had become so intricate that they resembled deliberate artwork rather than random staining. Eleanor began photographing the wall patterns, hoping to document their progression and perhaps find some explanation for their appearance. Her photographs revealed that the patterns were indeed changing over time, forming increasingly detailed representations of human figures in various stages of distress. Dr. Morrison returned to examine the building's condition in late August after James Forster contacted her about the worsening situation. Her follow-up analysis revealed that the salt deposits were not only continuing to form, but were actually increasing in concentration and chemical complexity. The newer deposits contained additional organic compounds that suggested ongoing biological activity, as if the building was somehow producing fresh, human biological matter, rather than simply releasing stored contaminants. The mystery deepened when Dr. Morrison's tests revealed the presence of electrical residue in the salt deposits, despite the fact that no high-voltage electrical equipment had been used in the building for over a year. The residue patterns suggested recent electrical activity, consistent with the type of current used in electrical execution, an impossibility given that all such equipment had been removed during renovation. These findings convinced Dr. Morrison that the building was experiencing some form of paranormal activity that defied conventional scientific explanation. The family's ordeal reached a crisis point on August 28, 1937, when young Margaret disappeared from her bedroom during the night. Eleanor discovered the child's absence during her morning routine, finding Margaret's bed empty despite the bedroom door being locked from the inside. A frantic search of the house revealed the 8-year-old standing in the living room, apparently asleep on her feet, positioned exactly where the electric chair had once been located. Margaret's sleepwalking incident was particularly disturbing because the child showed signs of electrical contact despite the absence of any electrical equipment in the room. Her hair was standing on end, as if charged with static electricity, and she complained of a metallic taste in her mouth upon awakening. Most alarming of all, Margaret's body temperature was significantly elevated, and she showed burn marks on her wrists and ankles, consistent with electrical contact. Dr. Campbell's emergency examination could find no explanation for these symptoms. The child's account of her experience, given after she had fully awakened, provided chilling details about her involuntary journey to the living room. Margaret claimed she had been awakened by a man in prison clothing who told her she needed to help him finish something important. The man had led her downstairs to the living room, where she saw dozens of other men waiting in chairs that she couldn't see clearly. According to Margaret, the men were all crying because they were scared, and their tears were making the walls wet. Margaret's description of her nocturnal encounter included specific details about the phantom figures that matched historical records of executed prisoners. She described men of various ages and races, all wearing identical grey prison uniforms and exhibiting signs of extreme distress. The child claimed that the men had asked her to help them leave the room, but she didn't understand what they wanted her to do. Her account suggested that the executed prisoners' spirits remained trapped in the location of their death, unable to move on to whatever existence awaited them after death. The sleepwalking incident convinced James and Eleanor that their home conversion project had been a terrible mistake. The building's violent history had created some form of psychic contamination that was affecting their entire family, particularly their youngest and most vulnerable child. The decision was made to abandon the property immediately and find alternative housing for the family, despite the financial loss this decision would entail. However, leaving the converted execution chamber proved more difficult than the family had anticipated. Each attempt to pack their belongings and prepare for departure was interrupted by increasingly aggressive paranormal activity. Furniture moved on its own, electrical systems malfunctioned despite being newly installed, and the salt deposits on the walls began forming into recognizable faces of men who had died in the electric chair. The phantom figures that Robert had been seeing became visible to other family members during their final week in the building. Eleanor reported seeing transparent shapes moving through the living room, men who appeared to be searching for something they had lost. Patricia witnessed similar apparitions in her bedroom, describing figures that seemed to be trying to communicate but could not make themselves heard. Even James, who had been skeptical of his family's paranormal experiences, began seeing shadowy forms moving through the house during both day and night hours. The family's departure was finally precipitated by an incident involving all three children simultaneously. On the evening of September 3rd, 1937, Eleanor found all three of her children standing in the living room in what appeared to be a trance state. They were arranged in a line facing the wall where the salt deposits had formed the clearest image of a human face, and all three children were weeping salt tears that matched the composition of the wall deposits. Dr. Campbell's emergency examination of the children revealed that they were in some form of synchronized, altered consciousness that he had never encountered in his medical practice. All three showed identical physiological symptoms, including elevated heart rate, increased body temperature, and electrical conductivity that should not have been present in healthy children. Most disturbing of all, their tears contained the same complex mixture of organic compounds that Dr. Morrison had identified in the wall deposits, suggesting that the building was somehow influencing their biological processes. The children's trance state lasted for approximately 2 hours, during which they remained motionless and unresponsive to external stimuli. When they finally returned to normal consciousness, all three reported identical experiences of standing in a room full of men who were asking for help leaving. The children described feeling compelled to cry on behalf of the phantom figures, who were unable to produce their own tears due to their death by electrical execution. This final paranormal encounter convinced the Forster family that they could not remain in the building under any circumstances. They packed only essential belongings and moved to a hotel that same night, abandoning most of their possessions and their substantial investment in the property renovation. The psychological trauma of their brief residence in the converted execution chamber would affect all family members for years to come, requiring ongoing medical and psychiatric treatment. The abandoned Forster residence attracted the attention of paranormal researchers from across the region, drawn by reports of one of the most active and well-documented haunting cases in Virginia history. Dr. Edmund Pierce, a psychologist from the University of Virginia who specialized in paranormal phenomena, conducted extensive interviews with the Forster family and documented their experiences in detail. His research confirmed that their accounts were consistent and showed no evidence of fabrication or mental illness. Dr. Pierce's investigation of the building itself revealed continuing paranormal activity, even in the absence of human occupants. The salt deposits continued to form on the walls, creating increasingly complex patterns that resembled detailed portraits of executed prisoners. Photography equipment malfunctioned in the former execution chamber, producing images that showed additional figures not visible to the naked eye. Most significantly, electrical equipment brought into the building registered current flows that should not have been possible without an active power source. The building changed hands several more times over the following decades, but no subsequent owner was able to make successful use of the property. A restaurant that operated in the building during the 1950s closed after customers complained of food that tasted persistently salty, and staff reported seeing phantom figures in the dining area. An antique shop that occupied the space in the 1960s failed when merchandise became coated with salt deposits that damaged valuable items and drove away customers. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied the site report that the building continues to exhibit unusual properties decades after the Forster family's departure. Electromagnetic field detectors register strong anomalies in the former execution chamber, and digital recording equipment captures sounds resembling electrical humming and human weeping. The salt deposits still form on walls, despite the building being vacant and receiving no human traffic. The scientific community remains divided on the explanation for the phenomena observed at the former Richmond execution chamber. Some researchers propose that the building materials became saturated with biological matter during years of use, creating ongoing chemical reactions that produce the observed salt deposits. Others suggest that the repeated trauma of violent death created some form of psychic imprint that continues to influence the physical environment decades later. Dr. Morrison's continued research into the chemical composition of the salt deposits has revealed increasingly complex organic compounds that seem to change and evolve over time. Her most recent analysis suggests that the deposits contain biological markers from multiple different individuals, as if the building somehow preserved and continues to release traces of every person who died within its walls. This finding supports the theory that the location itself has been permanently altered by the traumatic events that occurred there. The psychological impact on the Forster family persisted long after their departure from the converted execution chamber. Eleanor suffered from recurring nightmares for years and required ongoing psychiatric treatment for anxiety and depression related to her experiences. The children showed varying degrees of lasting trauma, with young Margaret requiring the most intensive therapeutic intervention to overcome her involuntary connection to the phantom figures she had encountered. James Forster never fully recovered financially from the loss of his investment in the property conversion project. The family was forced to live in modest rental housing for several years while rebuilding their savings and attempting to restore their normal lifestyle. James reportedly told friends that no amount of money would ever convince him to purchase another property with a violent history, regardless of the potential economic benefits. The case of the Forster family and their brief residence in Virginia's converted execution chamber represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of location-based paranormal activity in American history. The combination of multiple reliable witnesses, scientific analysis of physical evidence, and ongoing manifestations that continue decades later provides compelling support for the theory that some locations can be permanently altered by traumatic events. The specific nature of the paranormal activity observed in this case suggests that electrical execution may create particularly persistent forms of psychic disturbance. The combination of extreme fear, physical trauma, and electrical energy involved in this form of execution appears to leave behind traces that continue to affect the environment long after the original events. The salt deposits that gave the case its name may represent a physical manifestation of the tears and perspiration produced by condemned prisoners during their final moments. The broader implications of the Forster case extend beyond the specific paranormal phenomena observed. The family's experience demonstrates the importance of thoroughly researching the history of properties before making major investments, particularly in buildings that have been associated with violence or death. The case also highlights the potential psychological impact of living in locations where traumatic events have occurred, even when residents are unaware of or attempt to ignore this history. Modern urban development often involves the conversion of former institutional buildings into residential or commercial use, raising questions about the wisdom of repurposing structures that have been associated with human suffering. The Forster case suggests that some buildings may be so thoroughly contaminated by their violent history that they cannot be successfully converted to other uses without addressing the underlying psychic disturbance through appropriate intervention. The continuing paranormal activity at the former Richmond execution chamber serves as a reminder that the consequences of state-sanctioned violence may extend far beyond the intended punishment of condemned criminals. The 43 men and women who died in the electric chair created a legacy of suffering that has affected innocent families for generations, demonstrating that the true cost of capital punishment may include psychological and spiritual damage that cannot be easily quantified or contained. Today, the building that once housed Virginia's electric chair stands empty, its windows boarded and its doors sealed against curious visitors. Local authorities discourage investigation of the property, citing safety concerns related to structural deterioration and environmental hazards. Yet those familiar with the Forster family's ordeal understand that the real danger may lie not in physical decay, but in the possibility that the building continues to weep salt tears for men who died decades ago, their suffering preserved in crystalline form as an eternal reminder of justice gone wrong. What becomes of a place where so many people died in fear and agony? The Forster family's experience suggests that some forms of human suffering leave permanent marks on the physical world, traces that cannot be painted over or explained away. Perhaps their story serves as a warning that we ignore the violent aspects of our history at our own peril, and that the past has ways of making itself known to those who attempt to build their futures on foundations of death.